He opened his door expecting a neighbor. He found his entire string and the woman who brought them. The knock came at 5:45, when the sky was still more gray than anything else, and the coffee was just starting to hiss on the stove. I wasn't expecting anyone. I pulled on my boots without unlacing them all the way, a bad habit I've had since I was 22, and crossed the front room with one hand on the doorframe, because the floor had a soft spot near the entrance I kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing. 3 years of meaning to fix it. That's what happens when you live alone long enough. You start making peace with the soft spots. When I opened the door, I thought it was Dahlan from the next place over. He borrowed a splitting maul in the fall, and I had a feeling it was going to come back to me in some busted state, because that's the kind of man Dahlan was, good-hearted, careless with other men's tools. It wasn't Dahlan. It was a woman I had never seen in my life, standing on my porch in a coat that had road dust worked into every fold of it, a coat that might have been dark green once, holding a leather satchel in her left hand and looking at me the way people look at a thing they've been searching for and have finally found. A little relieved, a little wary, like they're not sure yet whether the finding is going to end well. Behind her, in the gray light, were my horses. I am not a man who shows much on his face. Took me a second. It took me a second because what I was seeing didn't arrange itself into anything reasonable right away. 5 horses. My 5 horses, the roan mare with the notch in her left ear, the 2 bays I'd raised from foals. You could tell them apart only by the fact that the older one listed slightly when he walked, a hitch in his left foreleg that was nothing serious, nothing that slowed him, just a thing he'd been born with, the gray with the 4 white stockings. And my best horse, the buckskin gelding I'd had for 11 years, the one I'd ridden through 2 hard winters and 1 flood, and trusted with my life in canyon country, standing at the end of the line like he'd never been anywhere at all. They were tied in a string, tied carefully. Lead ropes knotted in a way I recognized as someone who knew what they were doing. The woman said, "Mr. Cord." I said, "Yes. I believe these belong to you." I stepped off the porch without saying another word and went to the buckskin first. He pushed his nose into my chest and stood there. He smelled like trail, sweat, and dust and grass, and the particular cold of nights slept under open sky. I put my hand on the side of his neck and stood there for a moment with my eyes closed. I am not a man who prays much, but that was close to it. Then I went to each of them in turn. The roan, the bays, the gray, all of them there, all of them whole. They'd been taken 14 days ago. I walked back to the woman. She hadn't moved. She was watching me check the horses the way a person watches something they've been waiting a long time to finish. Quiet, patient, not needing to rush the moment. I said, "Who are you?" She said her name was Alma Voss. She'd come up from the basin country, she said. 240 miles, give or take. She said it the way you say a distance that isn't worth complaining about, just a number. I said, "How'd you come to have my horses?" "I didn't have them," she said. "I found out where they were, then I brought them." "That's a distinction." "It is," she said. She was maybe 38, 40. Dark hair with some gray coming in at the temples, pulled back but not carefully, the kind of hair that starts neat in the morning and goes its own way by noon. Strong hands. She was not a small woman, but she wasn't large either. Just solid. The kind of solid that comes from years of doing physical work and not thinking too hard about it. Her boots were good boots, well worn but cared for. The satchel she was holding was weather-darkened leather, the strap replaced at some point with a length of rope so neatly braided it had become its own kind of ornament. I said, "You'd better come inside." She came in and I put coffee in front of her and she drank it without talking for a minute, and I sat across the table and looked at her. Outside, the horses were standing at the rail. I'd tied them there without thinking, just didn't want them out of sight yet. She told me the story. 14 days before, I'd come out to the south pasture at first light to find the fence line cut and the horses gone. 5 of them. The whole string. I'd had them in the near pasture because I was planning to work with the buckskin that week, do some conditioning runs up through the ridge country before the real cold came in. The fence was cut clean, not broken, someone who knew what they were doing, someone who'd scouted it first. There were boot prints and the marks of a second set of horses, riders, and the whole thing had the feel of a job done by men who'd done it before. They'd taken what was worth taking and left everything else. The cattle were still there. The tack in the barn was untouched, saddles, bridles, a good rope I'd braided myself hanging on the near peg. Just the horses. Someone had known what they were coming for and where to find it, which told me they'd watched the place, probably more than once. That sat with me worse than the loss itself. The idea of men I couldn't name standing at the tree line at dusk watching my horses move in the pasture, calculating, taking inventory of what was mine. I'd ridden out the same day, tracked them south for 2 days until the trail went cold on hardpan, and then I'd made the rounds, the sheriff in Breckett, a deputy I knew in Harlan, men I'd traded with who had ears in the basin country. Nothing. The horses were gone. I came home and did what a man does when he's lost something and has no more moves left. I went back to work. I fed the cattle. I fixed the fence line they'd cut. I didn't sleep well. Alma Voss had come through the basin country 11 days ago on her way north. She'd stopped at a way station she'd used before, a place called Tyndall's, a trading post and rough kind of inn where men stopped overnight heading into the hills. There were horses in the corral at Tyndall's. She hadn't thought anything of it at first. Then she'd noticed the buckskin. "He's a particular-looking horse," she said. "He is," I said. She'd seen a horse like him before, or thought she had. She asked the man at Tyndall's whose horses they were. He'd said they were his, passing through, heading to a buyer in Laramie. She let it go and ate her supper, but something kept working at her. The horse had markings she didn't think you saw twice. The color was unusual, but it was also the way he held his head. And then she went back out after dark and looked at the roan and saw the notch in her ear. "I'd seen a notice," she said, "posted on the board at the land office in Creede 3 weeks back. Description of stolen horses including 1 buckskin gelding with a blaze and 3 socks, 1 roan mare with a notch in the left ear. I don't always read those. I read that one." "Why?" She looked at me. "Because someone had written it out by hand and it was detailed. You could tell the man who wrote it knew those horses." I had written it myself. I'd spent more time on that notice than I'd spent on most things I'd written in my life. I described each horse the way you describe something you're afraid no one else will be able to identify. The buckskin's particular way of holding his left ear forward when he was paying attention. The roan's notch and the patch of lighter hair below her eye. The older bay's hitch. I'd written 4 drafts of it at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low, and then I'd ridden into town and posted it and told myself it probably wouldn't do anything. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but everybody in this country knew. Once horses were moved past a certain distance, you didn't see them again. The sheriff in Breckett had been decent about it, taken the description, filed the paper, told me he'd send word if anything came up. His face, while he was telling me, said he didn't expect anything to come up. That face, I understood. It was the face of a man telling you the courteous version of what he actually thought. I'd ridden home and said nothing to anyone and got back to work. But I want to say something about that notice. I wrote it because there was nothing else to do, and a man who does nothing has given up, and I was not ready to give up. I wrote 4 drafts because the first 3 felt like the kind of description a stranger would write: height, color, approximate age, and that's not how I knew those horses. I knew the buckskin by the way he flicked his left ear back when he was deciding something. I knew the roan by the patch of lighter hair below her eye that you'd only notice if you'd looked at her close, in good light, which I had, many times. The older bay's hitch I could describe to someone who'd never seen it and they'd know it on sight. That's the kind of thing you know about a horse you've raised and worked with for years. I wrote it all down. I did not think it would help. I wrote it anyway, because writing it was the only thing left that was mine to do. So you remembered the notice, I said. I remembered it, and I went back in and told the man at Tyndall's I'd changed my mind. I'd stay another night. And I spent that night working out what I was going to do. What she did was this. She waited until the men who'd brought the horses in were asleep. Then she went to the man at Tyndall's and told him flatly that the horses in his corral were stolen. She named the owner, gave him the county and the general area, told him she had seen the notice with her own eyes, and that she was prepared to say so to any law officer he cared to bring. The man at Tyndall's was not a criminal. He was a nervous, practical man who did not want trouble. He made the men leave without the horses. She didn't know what he said to them, and she didn't ask. She heard raised voices and once what might have been something breaking. She sat at the table by the window with her hand on the pistol in her coat pocket and waited. By morning the men were gone, and the horses were still in the corral. Then she had to get them north. 240 miles. She'd done 100 of it alone, then fallen in with a freighter heading the right direction and traveled the remaining stretch with him, the horses trailing behind. It had taken 11 days. I sat with that for a moment. You went out of your way, I said. Some. How much out of your way? She looked at the window. I was heading to Casper. This is north of Casper by about 60 miles. So she'd come 60 miles past where she was going, with my 5 horses, and knocked on my door at 5:45 in the morning. I said, "What do you want for this?" She looked at me then with something that wasn't quite offense but was close to it. Nothing. That's not reasonable, I said. I didn't do it for payment. Then why? She was quiet a moment. Because they were your horses and someone had taken them, and I knew where they were and you didn't. That was the whole answer. She said it like it was simple, like what she'd done was just a plain thing that followed plainly from what she knew. I have met a lot of people in my life. I have met people who did good things because they wanted something back, and people who did good things because they wanted to feel good about themselves, and people who did good things because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. I have met very few people who did a hard thing because it needed doing, and because they were the ones who could do it, and that was reason enough. I got up and put more coffee in her cup and sat back down. "You'll stay for breakfast," I said. It wasn't a question. She stayed for breakfast. Her name was Alma. She was a widow, had been for 6 years. Her husband had ranched in the Basin country down near where the Purgatory River turned west, and when he died she'd sold the ranch and taken up work that kept her moving, buying and selling horses, running small commissions, carrying messages or goods for people who needed things moved between places. She was good at it, she said. She liked the motion of it. She'd gotten used to traveling alone and found she didn't mind it. She ate eggs and bread without fussing and drank 3 cups of coffee and didn't say more than she had to. I found I liked that. I have spent most of my adult life in the company of men who talk too much or don't talk at all, and a woman who talked at the right rate was a thing I'd nearly forgotten existed. My name is Caleb Cord. I am 63 years old. I have had this ranch for 22 years, bought it from a man who was giving up on it, which meant I got it for less than it was worth, which also meant the first 5 years were spent fixing everything the man had let go to ruin. I built the good parts of it myself. The barn roof, the corral fencing, the water line from the creek, the holding pen on the north side that now kept 20 head dry through the worst of a mountain winter. There are men in this county who will tell you Cord's Place is one of the better operations in this part of the territory, and I am not too proud to say I believe them, because I know what it cost. When the man I bought from signed over the deed, I rode out to the south pasture and sat my horse and looked at what I'd purchased and felt the weight of it. Not in a bad way. In the way you feel the weight of a thing you've been working toward. The land was rocky and the fencing was poor, and the barn had a roof that needed replacing within 2 years or it would need replacing in a worse way, and all of that was true and visible, and I looked at it all and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has found the right problem. That's what I am, a man who does better when there's a right problem in front of him. The ranch was a right problem. 22 years in, it was mostly solved. There were years in there that were very hard. The first winter I lost 14 head to cold I hadn't properly prepared for, and that loss came out of money I didn't have and set me back in ways I spent 2 years recovering from. The third year there was a drought that cracked the creek bed, and I was hauling water from a spring half a mile up the ridge all of July and August. The 8th year, a fire started in the dry grass on the east boundary, and I fought it for 3 days and lost the east fence line and a stand of timber that had given me good wind protection. These things happened and I dealt with them and kept going. There was nobody to tell. That wasn't self-pity, it just was what it was. The ranch was mine and the problems were mine and the solutions were mine, and you don't spend 22 years like that without it changing how you carry yourself. You become a man who handles things. Sometimes that's a strength, and sometimes, I've come to think, it's a way of forgetting that you don't have to handle everything alone if you don't want to. I had been married once. My wife Alina died in the winter of 1881, of fever, the kind that comes fast and goes nowhere and doesn't leave much room for anything to be said or done before it's over. We had 4 years together, good years, and then I had 22 years without her, and I had made my peace with the shape of that life. You do. You find the rhythm of a thing and you live inside it. The horses being taken had knocked something loose in me that I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the horses, though the horses mattered. Each one of them was a piece of work I'd done, years of selection and training and care, real money and real time. It was something else. It was the cut fence line, the boot prints in the mud. The way someone had come onto what was mine in the dark and just taken it, and there was nothing I'd been able to do about it, and the tracking led nowhere, and the notice I'd written went unanswered, and I came home and went on doing the things you do when there's nothing else left to do. A man my age doesn't have that many things left that he's built from nothing. I have the ranch. I had the horses. And someone had just walked into that and taken half of what I had, and I hadn't been able to stop them or get it back. And then she knocked on my door. We didn't talk much over breakfast. Afterwards, she helped me water the horses and check them over properly in the morning light, which she did competently and without needing to be directed. She knew horses. She ran her hands down the legs of each one, checked their hooves, looked at their eyes. She checked the buckskin's hooves and told me he'd thrown a shoe somewhere in the last day, and she'd tied a cloth around his leg that morning because the bare hoof had been bothering him on the hardpan. I hadn't noticed the cloth. I felt something about that she'd noticed and done something about it before I'd even seen it. I looked at the buckskin's wrapped leg and didn't say anything for a moment. "You checked him this morning," I said. "Before I knocked," she said. "I wanted to be sure they'd traveled well." That stopped me. She'd stood in my yard in the cold at some hour before 5:45, checking over my horses one by one to make sure they were all right, before she'd even introduced herself or told me why she was there. Just to be sure. She had a horse of her own tied at the end of my rail, a plain brown mare with a sensible face and a good depth of chest, the kind of horse you'd pick if you were going to ride 240 miles without drama. I asked her where she was headed in Casper. She said she had a commission waiting, someone who needed horses moved from a ranch outside Casper to buyers in the north, a working job. She was 3 days late arriving. "Will they wait?" I said. "They'll wait," she said. "I've done work for them before. They know I'm reliable." "You went 60 miles out of your way for a stranger." "I did." "That cost you 3 days." "It did." She wasn't apologetic about it. She wasn't performing anything. She'd made a decision and done a thing, and the consequences were part of it, and she'd accepted them. I found I didn't know what to do with that. I had been living alone a long time, and somewhere in those years I developed a low expectation of people, not a bitter one, just a realistic one. People let you down in small ways and you didn't hold it against them, but you stopped expecting much. It kept things simpler. She didn't seem to know about that arrangement. I went inside and got the money I kept in the box under the floorboard in the back room, an amount that felt right for what she'd done, which was not a complete accounting of it but was something. I came back out and held it out to her. She looked at it. "I told you," she said. "I know what you told me. Take it for the feed and the 3 lost days and call the rest whatever you want." She looked at the money for another moment and then took it. Not eagerly, just correctly, the way you take a thing that is reasonable and there's no good reason to refuse. "Thank you," I said. She tucked the money away. "They're good horses, the roan especially." "She is." "The older bay, the one that hitches, old injury." "Born with it." She nodded like that confirmed something she'd thought. She'd been watching him move. Then she said she needed to get on the road if she was going to make time before dark. I walked with her to her horse. She checked the girth, checked a tie on her bedroll, tucked something into her saddlebag. Ready. She was someone who traveled and knew how to leave. She put her foot in the stirrup and then stopped. She was looking at the buckskin, who was at the near rail, still watching us. She said without turning around, "The men who took them, do you know who they were?" "I have an idea," I said. "Nothing I can prove." "You want me to tell you what the men at Tyndall's looked like?" I had not asked her that. I looked at her. "Yes," I said. She turned and described them. She had a good memory. 2 men, one big, 30 or so, with a particular scar on his chin. One smaller, older, with a reddish beard gone to gray. She described their horses, their saddles, the way they'd talk to each other, a brand she'd seen on the saddle blanket of the bigger man. She gave me all of it without being asked and without embellishment, just the facts in the order they were useful. The saddle blanket brand was a thing I recognized. I didn't show it on my face, but I stored it away. "Thank you," I said. She got on her horse. She settled into the saddle the way a person settles into something they've done 10,000 times, no production, no fuss, just in. She looked down at me. "The notice you wrote," she said, "at the land office in Creed. What about it?" "It was a good description." "That's why I remembered it." She paused. "You described the horses the way you knew them, not the way you thought someone else would need them described. That's how I knew they were yours." She turned her horse and rode out of the yard, and I stood there and watched her go until she was a moving shape in the gray morning light, and then a smaller shape, and then nothing. I looked at my horses. The buckskin was watching the direction she'd gone. I spent the rest of that day doing what needed to be done, putting the horses back in the south pasture, which I'd fixed with new fencing and an extra rail, checking them each over properly in the afternoon light, taking the cloth off the buckskin's leg, and seeing that the hoof was fine, just a shoe lost, nothing tender underneath. I called on a farrier 2 days later and got him shod proper. I found I couldn't stop thinking about the saddle blanket brand. It belonged to a man named Galt who ran a loose operation south of the territory line, not a ranch exactly, more of a place where certain kinds of men gathered between certain kinds of jobs. I'd heard his name before in the way you hear names in this country sideways, from people who knew people, never in a direct accusation. He was the kind of man who arranged things and let other men take the consequences. The 2 at Tyndall's had been hired hands, probably. They might not even know whose horses they'd been moving or who they'd stolen them from. They were instruments of someone else's calculation, which in some ways made it worse and in some ways made it simpler. I spent a week thinking about it, then I rode south. I'm not going to tell the whole of what I did about Galt and those 2 men, except to say I did something and it had results, and I was not the only man who'd been wronged by Galt's arrangements, and therefore I was not the only man interested in a resolution. The deputy I knew in Harlan turned out to be more useful than I'd expected once I gave him something concrete to work with. There are 2 men who will think twice before cutting another man's fence line, and Galt no longer does business in this part of the territory, and I still don't have anything I could prove in a court of law, and I am at peace with that. A man my age, 22 years into building a thing, does not let that kind of violation go unanswered and does not lose sleep over the manner of his answer. But that's not the part of this I've been turning over ever since. The part I've been turning over is this. A woman I'd never met read a notice I'd posted at a land office 3 weeks before. She remembered it well enough to recognize a horse she saw in a corral by lamplight in a way station 200 miles away. She arranged for those horses to be freed, and then she brought them north, alone for 100 miles, and then with a freighter for the rest, and she came 60 miles past where she was going and knocked on my door at 5:45 in the morning. She didn't want anything for it. She took the money I pressed on her because it was reasonable, not because she needed it or had planned on it. She gave me a description of the men I hadn't asked for because she understood it might matter. She noticed my horse's wrapped hoof before I did and had already tended to it. She stood in my yard in the dark before dawn and checked each of my horses one by one to make sure they'd traveled well. And then she left. I went over it for days. I'm not a man who goes over things for days. I've always been someone who settles a thing in his head and moves on, mostly because there's always work that needs doing and because sitting in your own head too long usually doesn't improve anything. But this I kept returning to. I hadn't done anything to deserve what she did. That was the part I couldn't get past. I'd written a notice, that was all. I'd written it carefully because I knew those horses and I wanted whoever read it to know them too, but that was a small thing. It hadn't even worked the way I'd meant it to. She'd seen the notice weeks before and it had just lodged somewhere in her mind, and then accident and her own attention had done the rest. Her attention, the particular quality of attention she brought to everything. She read a notice and she remembered it, fully, the way she'd remember something that mattered. I have been in this country a long time. I know the kinds of people it produces, men who are hard because they have to be, men who are generous when generosity costs them nothing and quiet when it costs them something, men who will help a neighbor through a bad winter and look the other way when something questionable moves through their land. I know the women too, the ones who have stayed and the ones who have gone, the ones built for this life and the ones it ground down. I have known a great variety of people, and I had a pretty accurate accounting of what to expect from most of them. I did not have an accounting for all of us. What she had done was not complicated when you laid it out plainly. She saw a thing that was wrong. She was in a position to do something about it. She did something about it. That's the whole of it, stated simply. But simple things are not always easy things, and what I kept coming back to was the cost of it to her. Not the cost she'd mention if you asked, which was 3 days and 60 miles, but the other cost. The risk of it. She had confronted strange men in a way station in the middle of the night over horses that weren't hers, with nothing backing her up but a memory of a notice she'd read 3 weeks before in a different county. She'd sat at a table with her hand on a pistol and waited while those men were made to leave. She was a woman alone in a way station with rough men who had something to lose, and she had done that. And then she'd taken 5 horses she'd never handled before and ridden 100 miles with them, and found a freighter going the right direction, and traveled another 140 and come 60 miles past her destination, and knocked on a stranger's door. Because they were his horses, and someone had taken them. That's what I kept returning to. Not just what she'd done, but why. There was no reason in it except the plainest kind, that it was the right thing to do and she was the person who could do it. That kind of reason sounds simple, but in my experience it is the rarest reason of all. Most people find a way around it when the cost gets high enough. She hadn't found her way around it. She had not helped me because I asked. She had not helped me because I was in front of her. She'd helped me because she saw what had happened to me from 200 miles away and decided that wasn't right and that she was going to do something about it. And what she did required 11 days of her time and 60 miles of extra road, and arriving 3 days late to a commission, and sitting alone at a way station table with her hand on a pistol, while rough men were made to give up something they'd stolen. That's a different thing. That's a thing I hadn't encountered in longer than I could precisely say. A week after she left, I found myself at the kitchen table writing a letter. I didn't know her address in Casper. I didn't know where she'd be after the commission was finished, or how long she was staying in the territory, or whether she had a fixed address anywhere. I wrote the letter anyway and addressed it to general delivery in Casper, and told myself if it found her, and if it didn't, it didn't. I wrote that I had settled the matter of the men who'd taken the horses, and that I wanted her to know it was settled. I wrote that the buckskin was shod and had been working well. I wrote that I had been thinking about what she'd done, and that I wanted her to know it had mattered to me in a way that went beyond the horses, though the horses mattered considerably. I wrote that a man in my position, by which I meant my age and my circumstances, though I didn't explain it in so many words, did not come across people who acted from that kind of plainness of purpose very often, and that I had not taken it lightly even if I hadn't said much about it at the time. I got to the end and then sat for a while. Then I wrote that if she passed through this part of the country again, I hoped she would stop. That was all I wrote. I sealed it and wrote it into town and posted it, and then I told myself it was a reasonable thing to do and stopped worrying about it. 3 weeks went by. I heard nothing which I expected. I went on working. The cold was coming in now, real cold, the kind that gets into the ground and stays there. I brought the cattle down from the summer pasture and started laying in the wood and doing the weathering work on the barn. The south pasture fence I'd repaired was holding. The horses were in the near paddock on cold nights, in the pasture on the days that weren't too severe. The buckskin was in good form. I'd been riding him through the ridge country the way I'd planned to before the horses were taken, and he was strong and sure and responded to my hands the way a horse does when he trusts you and you trust him, not with drama, just with a particular quality of being together in it, both of you knowing your job. Up through the ridge trail in the early mornings with the cold air pressing and the light coming sideways through the pine stands, him finding his footing on the loose shale without being told. 11 years. A horse that old that you've had that long doesn't need much guidance anymore. He knows what you're going to ask before you ask it. Riding him those mornings, I thought about the woman who'd noticed his wrapped hoof and mentioned it without making much of it. Checked him before she knocked on my door. The soft spot in the floor near the front door, I fixed it. I fixed it in the 3rd week of November when the ground was frozen and there wasn't much else to do outside. I pulled the board and put a new one in, and while I was down there, I noticed the whole floor needed looking at, and I spent 2 days on it. It occurred to me while I was doing it that I had been meaning to fix that floor for 3 years and had not done it, and now I was doing it. I did not examine this too closely. I also cleared out the room at the back of the house. It had been storage for a long time, boxes of things that belonged to Alina mostly, things I hadn't felt like dealing with and had been moving around the room for 2 decades without ever actually sorting. I sorted them. Some things I put away properly. The rest I let go of, which was a thing I'd been needing to do and hadn't, and now I had. I swept the room and found it had a window that faced east and let in good morning light and a solid floor and a decent amount of space. I put a bed in it and a lamp on the sill and left it there, clean and open, which was better than it had been. She arrived on a Thursday in the 1st week of December. I heard horses in the yard and came to the window and looked out, and there was a wagon, a freighter's rig, the same man she'd traveled with before, I would learn, and her brown mare tied behind it, and Alma Voss standing in the yard in the green coat, which had been cleaned somewhere along the way and looked more like what it had once been. She was looking at the barn. She looked at the barn the way a person looks at a thing they're evaluating, not critically. Just looking the way she looked at everything. I went outside. She said, "I got your letter." I said, "I didn't know if it would reach you." It reached me in Casper. I'd already left by then. The postmaster forwarded it to a place in Cheyenne. She paused. I was coming north again for another commission. I came this way. 60 miles out of your way again, I said. 55 this direction. She said it without any particular expression, and I felt something move in my chest that I recognized, dimly, as something I hadn't felt in a good while. Something settling into place. Not a big thing. Just a thing settling, the way a floorboard settles when you put it in right. Come inside, I said. It's cold. She came inside. I put coffee on. The floor didn't creak under her feet. She noticed that. She put her foot down in the doorway and then looked down at the boards with an expression that was almost a smile. Fixed it, I said. Good floor, she said. She sat at the table in the same chair she'd sat in before, and I put coffee in front of her and sat across the table, and we talked. We talked the way two people talk who are cautious but not unwilling, who have a history that is short but is real, who are feeling out whether what they think is there is actually there. She told me about the commission. Horses moved from a place in Wyoming to buyers in the Dakotas. A 3-week job that had stretched to 5 because of weather and a complication with papers. She told me about the freighter, whose name was Hewson, who was a taciturn man with a good sense of direction and a loud laugh that showed up without warning in the middle of otherwise quiet hours. She told me about a night in a camp in the Laramie Range when the temperature dropped so fast the creek froze while she was watching it. She'd been sitting on a rock eating a biscuit, and she heard the water slowing and then stopping and looked down, and it was a sheet of ice where 5 minutes before it had been running. I told her about the matter of the horse's thieves and how it had resolved. I told her the way you tell something to a person who gave you the information that made it possible directly, without softening it, because she'd earned that. She listened without flinching. When I finished, she nodded once and looked at the table and then looked at me. Good, she said. That was all. I told her about the buckskin, the conditioning rides, how he'd been going through the ridge country. She listened the way she listened to everything, which was completely, not performing interest, just actually paying attention, which in my experience is rarer than it should be. She asked one question about the trail, and I answered it, and she thought about the answer for a moment in a way I could see her doing it, like she was placing it somewhere useful. She stayed 3 days. She slept in the room at the back that I'd cleared and put the bed in. She didn't comment on it being freshly readied. She just put her satchel down and looked at the east window and said it would get the morning light, which was true. We ate together in the mornings and evenings. She was not a woman who needed to fill silence, and neither was I, which meant the meals had a quality I hadn't experienced at that table in a very long time. Just 2 people eating food in a warm kitchen while cold air pressed at the windows, and it being enough. Being more than enough if I was being honest. The second day she helped me bank the south side of the barn for winter, carrying rocks and packing earth, which is not a glamorous job and takes real physical work. She did it without being asked and without slowing down. We worked alongside each other for 2 hours without talking much except to coordinate the work, and I was aware of working alongside another person, which was a different sensation than working alone. Not worse, just different. The kind of different that makes you realize you've been doing a thing one way for so long you'd stopped noticing it was only one way. We talked in the evenings by the lamp. She told me about her husband, not with grief, not exactly, more with the kind of distance that 6 years and a person's nature produces. He had been a good man. He had not been easy to live with, but he had been good. She had loved him and she had mourned him, and she had sold the ranch and moved on because she was a person who moved on when there was nothing left to stay for. Did you want to stay? I asked. She thought about it. Parts of me did, but the parts that wanted to stay were the parts that didn't want to feel the loss. That's different from actually wanting to stay. I've learned to tell the difference. How? You ask yourself whether you'd want to stay if nothing were keeping you. If the answer's still yes, you stay. If the answer's no, you go. I thought about that for a while. It was a clear-headed way to think about things, the kind of thinking that had probably cost her something before she'd arrived at it. She asked me about the horses, not the stolen ones, but how I'd come to have them in the first place, how I'd built the string. I told her. I told her about finding the buckskin as a 2-year-old at a sale in Pueblo, a young horse nobody wanted because he was spooky and difficult, and had thrown 2 riders that morning. I bought him because under the spookiness I could see he was intelligent. A horse that's afraid usually is, the same way a dog that bites usually has a reason. I spent 6 months just making friends with him before I asked anything of him. By the end of the first year, he'd settle under my hand in 30 seconds flat. By the end of the second year, he was the steadiest horse I owned. "That's patient work," she said. "It is," I said, "but it pays." She looked at the lamp a moment. "You think people are like that too, given enough time and the right handling?" "Some of them," I said. "Not all." "Which kind do you think you are?" I thought about it. "I think I'm one that doesn't spook easily anymore," I said, "but took some time to get there." She looked at me then, and something in her expression shifted just slightly, a softening around the eyes that was there and then not there, quick as a shadow crossing the floor. She picked up her coffee cup and looked at it. "That's probably the most honest thing anyone said to me in a while," she said. I told her about Eleanor. I don't talk about Eleanor. I found I was talking about Eleanor. I told her about the 4 years and about the winter of 1881, and about the particular quality of loss that is not the dramatic kind but the kind where someone is there, and then they're not there, and the world keeps going and you keep going and 20 years go by, and it's still a shape you notice. An absence with a specific outline. She listened. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she said, "That sounds like a particular kind of loneliness." "It is," I said. "Do you still have it?" I thought about that. "Some of it," I said, "less than I did." She looked at me. It was evening, the lamp was lit, the windows were dark outside, and she looked at me with the direct, clear attention she gave everything. Not soft, just genuine. And then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, just for a moment, just briefly, and it was not a romantic gesture exactly. It was something more fundamental than that. It was acknowledgement. It was a person saying without words that she saw what was there, that she took it seriously, that she was not going to look away from it. I did not move my hand. I sat with it. She moved her hand and picked up her coffee cup. "I'm through here by the end of the week," she said. "The next commission is in Miles City. After that, I'm not sure." I said, "Are you ever in one place for very long?" "Not for a few years," she said. "I got used to moving. I'm not sure I know how to stop." "I'm not sure I know how to not stop," I said. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile. "No," she said, "I imagine not. A man builds a thing like this, he doesn't leave it." "Not easily." "No." We left it there. We both understood what was inside what we were saying, and we left it there. Not because there was nothing more to say, but because things that matter can afford to go slowly and don't have to be pressed. You live long enough. You learn the difference between silence that's an ending and silence that's a room you're both standing in, deciding whether to stay. This was the second kind. The third morning she was packing her things before I was up. I came into the kitchen and the lamp was already lit and there was coffee made, and she was at the table with her satchel at her feet. She looked up when I came in. "Early," I said. "Houston wants to make Laramie before the weather turns," she said. "There's a front coming." I sat down and poured coffee, and we sat there in the early dark. The horses could be heard moving in the paddock, which they did in the cold, just shifting, staying warm. The buckskin would be doing that slow head bob he did when the temperature dropped, rhythmic and patient. After a while she said, "The letter you wrote. What about it?" "You wrote that what I did mattered in a way that went beyond the horses." "I did." "I believed you," she said. She looked at her coffee. I don't meet many people who say what they mean. I try to, I said. She looked up at me. There was something she was deciding. I could see her deciding it, not because she showed it loudly, but because I'd spent 3 days learning to read the quality of her expressions, which were not many but were all real. Miles City through the winter, she said, and after that I don't know, I might come back this direction in the spring. If you do, I said, stop here. I will, she said. She said it simply, and I believed her. Not because people always mean what they say, I've been around long enough to know they don't, but because she did. She was a woman who had come 240 miles to return a stranger's horses because that was what needed doing. A woman like that, when she said a thing, meant it. I walked her out to the yard. Hewson's rig was there, the horses stamping in the cold, breath rising in the still air. She tied her brown mare to the back and went around to say something to Hewson, and then came back and stood in the yard in front of me. The morning was very cold and very clear. The sky had that winter quality, blue so deep it looked like it was pressing down on everything beneath it. The light was coming sideways, long and thin, the way it comes in December. My breath and hers made small clouds and disappeared. She put her hand out, I took it. Her grip was firm the way it always was. She held it a moment longer than a handshake strictly requires, and looked at me with that direct, undecorated attention of hers, not asking for anything to be different, not adding anything that wasn't there, just seeing what was and holding it. Cord, she said. Was, I said. She went around to the wagon and climbed up, and Hewson clicked the horses forward, and they went out of the yard and down the lane, and the brown mare came after, and I stood and watched them go. My buckskin was at the paddock fence watching too, ears forward, tracking the sound of the wagon until it faded into the cold morning. I stayed there until they were well down the lane. The cold pressed against my neck and ears, and I didn't go inside. I stood and looked at the lane and the ranch around me, the barn with its banked south wall, the sound pastures, the good fence line, the horses that were mine and standing where they should be, and I felt the weight of it in a way that was different from how I usually felt it. I'd built this, all of it, 22 years of early mornings and hard seasons and choices made alone and problems solved alone and losses absorbed alone. There were things in this county that existed only because I decided they should exist and then worked until they did. The water line, the north pen, the horses in the south pasture, the good barn. A man who knew what he was looking at could walk this ranch and read 22 years of decisions made with care. That was a real thing. A man doesn't get to 63 with a place like this without it being real. And a woman had seen it, not performed seeing it, not said the right things about it. She had looked at my barn the day she arrived and stood there evaluating it quietly. She had helped bank its south wall and carried rocks without being asked and done 2 hours of cold work without complaint. She had eaten at my table and listened when I talked about a leaner and put her hand over mine when it mattered. She had brought my horses home from 200 miles away because they were mine and they were stolen, and she was in a position to do something about it. She would come back in the spring, she'd said so. The buckskin tossed his head, and I went over and put my hand on his neck. He was warm against my palm, that particular warm that horses hold even in hard cold, something in them deeper than the air around them. The cold was getting into my fingers. I ought to go in. There was work to do, always work to do, and I didn't mind that, had never minded it. A man with work to do is a man with something to get up for. But I stood there another minute with my hand on the buckskin's neck and the clear winter sky above and the solid ground of what I'd built all around me. A man who'd lost his horses 14 days ago and thought he wasn't getting them back, who'd tracked them and found nothing, who'd posted a notice at a land office and expected nothing, who'd come home and gone back to work the way you do when there's nothing else to do, carrying the weight of it and the silence of it, and the particular injury of having something taken that you'd built with your own hands over years. And a woman had read that notice carefully enough to remember a horse she hadn't seen yet, and she'd knocked on my door. I stayed with the buckskin until my hands were too cold to feel him properly. Then I went inside, poured the last of the coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the good floor solid under my feet and the spring ahead of me, and let that be enough for now.